Tonight, we begin with a leak that has rattled the very heart of Britain's most closely guarded institution. The revelation did not come from palace insiders. It did not come from political aides. It came from an unexpected source, a therapist. On the morning of July 20th, 2025, an encrypted MI6 document quietly surfaced on an internal channel. It was not tied to any active intelligence mission, nor to espionage. It was instead the transcript of sessions spanning nearly 3 years with a California-based trauma therapist. What stunned officials was the nature of the entry's confessions and obsessions recorded clinically, now flagged as a national concern. One statement was highlighted in red: "If Kate keeps rising, I'll never be free. I need her gone in every way." 14 words that turned what had been dismissed as family rivalry into a profile of dangerous fixation. Analysts warned this was not drama. This was escalation. The notes outlined recurring themes: resentment over media comparisons to Diana, jealousy of Catherine's goodwill, paranoia about William's increasing global stature. Most troubling was a pattern: if Harry failed to control the public narrative, the subject felt she would lose herself. In the language of psychology, this was displacement projection and identity collapse, all with Kate as the perceived threat. Behind closed doors in London, officials briefed the palace. The public was unaware, but inside MI6 there was no mistaking the severity. A royal conflict had morphed into a question of security. And then the story moved further. A whistleblower emerged, not a disgruntled staffer, not a tabloid writer, but a former MI6 linguistics officer now working in cybersecurity. She had been tasked with reviewing the therapist's file for signs of manipulation or radicalization. Midway through the analysis, she broke protocol. She captured a screenshot. She circled one line, and she sent it to a journalist who once investigated royal ethics for the BBC. That line read, "The only way to keep her brand untouchable was to make Kate untouchable by force if needed." The context stopped analysts cold. The words did not specify physical harm, but they were direct enough to show obsession had turned into strategy. This was no longer passive resentment. It had direction. Very soon, the leak traveled further than anyone had expected. Kensington sources admitted Catherine had been briefed privately, describing her as unsettled. And on LBC Radio, respected commentator Lady Evelyn Bram spoke the words that would spread virally across social platforms. "This is not Meghan versus Kate anymore. This is Meghan versus consequences. And those consequences have teeth." That line ignited a wave, and it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, more material from the therapist's logs emerged. One entry dated April 2025 struck a chord inside MI6. "They want her to be queen one day. That can't happen. If she becomes untouchable, I'll become disposable." The word untouchable was repeated in at least 5 separate sessions. To analysts, this was not simply anger, it was calculation. The pattern was chilling. In March of that year, the subject reportedly rehearsed lines for a media interview in the therapist's office. "I was only trying to protect my mental health." Another, "Some people just couldn't stand seeing me happy." There was no scandal at the time that would have prompted such preparation. To outside experts, this was rehearsal for an inevitable reckoning. One trauma specialist later explained if someone rehearses betrayal lines months before any betrayal is exposed, it is not protection. It is premeditation. Then came the statement that shifted the case from clinical psychology into national security. On May 8, 2025, the notes record, "There are ways to make someone break without ever touching them. All you have to do is flood the air around them. Whisper campaigns, pressure points, silence in the right places." This was not dismissed as therapy venting. MI6 investigators had already been monitoring anonymous social accounts, posting smear campaigns about Catherine attacking her parenting, her mental health, even her manner of speaking. When the therapist's notes matched the digital footprint, the alarm was raised. MI6 issued an internal behavioral memo, It read, "The subject demonstrates advanced knowledge of reputational targeting and intent to control narrative outcomes through indirect attrition." Translation: This was deliberate image warfare. Inside, Parliament whispers began. Could therapy confidentiality be maintained when the content hinted at strategy against the nation's most visible figure? Dame Harriet Mason, a former ethics commissioner, told a panel, "If the mental health profession becomes the hiding place for dangerous ambitions, we have blurred the line between healing and strategy." For Catherine herself, the irony was stark. For years she had avoided confrontation, kept away from social media, and declined to respond publicly to accusations. Silence had been her shield. But according to the leaked notes, that silence was perceived as power, and therefore as threat. One aide's confidential memo read, "The princess assumed silence was distance. She did not know it was design." The notes described resentment that Catherine's silence made her appear saintly. Repeatedly, the subject told the therapist, "I can't win against someone who pretends not to play the game." In the world of narrative warfare, silence had become the ultimate weapon, and to the one watching from across the Atlantic, it was a weapon that had to be broken. The obsession, however, extended beyond Britain. Another log, dated February 12, 2025, captured a larger plan. "Once I win America's heart, the UK will have no choice. They'll rewrite history in real time, and she'll be the one who looks petty." Inside MI6, a covert project named Sapphire began mapping social media patterns. Their discovery, several high-engagement gossip accounts used phrasing identical to words in the therapy notes, including the now infamous nickname, Ice Doll Queen. It was not coincidence. It was orchestration. By early July, Prince William was quietly briefed by MI6, not by palace courtiers. His response, recorded in closed-door notes, was blunt. "If someone is exploiting mental health to plan a narrative takedown of my wife, that's not royal business. That's criminal business." The gloves were off, and the revelations were about to move into an even darker phase, because written notes were one thing, but tapes were another. On July 9, 2025, a diplomatic courier arrived in London carrying a sealed case under protection. Inside were 4 audio recordings, backup tapes from the therapist's practice in California, preserved for legal liability. These were not palace leaks, not second-hand notes, but the subject's own voice. One recording captured the line, "If Harry still loved his family, I wouldn't have to protect us like this. I'm not trying to hurt Kate. I'm trying to survive her." The tone was sharp, defensive, emotional, but consistently framed as defense, never attack. A second tape, dated May 2, 2025, was more pointed. "They made her untouchable by hiding her flaws. I'll make her touchable again with 1,000 cuts." It was an echo of earlier notes, but in her own voice. Analysts flagged the language as a thesis, relentless erosion, not sudden confrontation. MI6 used advanced voice-matching software, cross-referenced with 2 independent linguistics labs. The result? A 99.7% vocal match with archived interviews. For Parliament, the evidence moved from hearsay to near certainty. And within the tapes, another phrase recurred 3 times, "break the myth," and the crown falls with it. MI6 analysts described this as a replacement theory: dismantle Catherine's image and weaken the entire royal structure, leaving room for another narrative to dominate. As the tapes circulated in classified sessions, Parliament faced an uncomfortable truth. If any other public figure, celebrity, banker, even a teacher, had used therapy sessions to plot reputational takedowns, it would already be branded coordinated defamation. Only the royal connection kept voices restrained. Even former friends began to back away. In an interview with a New York journalist, one ex-member of the subject's inner circle admitted, "There were things she said about Kate that made us uncomfortable, but we thought it was rivalry. This is something else." The therapist herself had stayed silent. Bound by professional ethics, she had resisted public comment. But as the recordings were analyzed, she too reached a breaking point. On July 6th, in a closed meeting with MI6 legal counsel, she submitted a written declaration. Her words were stark. There came a point where the sessions no longer felt safe for me as a clinician. The repeated focus on Catherine and on undermining her public image began to resemble strategic conditioning, not healing. The room fell silent. The profession that had been designed for recovery was now described as rehearsal. Watchdogs called it a playbook. Investigators connected more dots. A June 3, 2025 entry read, "If Kate doesn't crumble on her own, we'll help gravity along." It was unclear who we referred to, but MI6 had already noted chatter about crisis managers contracted to push narratives online. The convergence was undeniable verbal escalation and digital echo chambers working in tandem. Meanwhile, Hollywood began to recoil. A senior executive quietly told Variety that what once seemed a redemption arc now felt like a takeover strategy. Netflix reportedly cut scenes from an upcoming project to soften references to Catherine after focus groups turned sharply. Surveys showed 62% of viewers no longer trusted a documentary produced under her name, while 71% believed Catherine had been unfairly targeted. What had begun as optics was now described as brand collapse in slow motion. Yet in private sessions, the subject insisted she was the one under siege. "They're trying to trap me as the villain because I don't play by their rules." But I was never going to bow. For MI6 and Parliament defiance was no longer the issue. The question was national credibility. And so on July 5th, MI6 formally handed a redacted file complete with audio transcripts to a classified parliamentary subcommittee. The operation was given a name, Whistle Crown. Inside that room, MPs described the findings as a psychological operation masked as therapy. One source told The Telegraph, "I've never seen a public figure so calmly plan another woman's erasure." Several MPs left visibly shaken. The evidence was no longer whispers or tabloids. It was written, it was recorded, it was authenticated, and it was about to hit even closer to home. By the second week of July, Catherine herself was fully briefed. For months she had stayed silent, maintaining a deliberate distance from controversy. But now the tone shifted. Security protocols around her family were quietly reinforced. School runs for her children were rerouted. Internal communications inside Kensington Palace were scrubbed and re-encrypted. What began as whispers of rivalry had turned into a matter of safety. A longtime friend, speaking anonymously to The Times, described her as devastated, not only by the betrayal of trust, but by the thought that she had been smiling across from someone privately planning her downfall. She has been hunted in public and now in private. "How much more strength are we expecting from one woman?" the friend asked. Prince Harry, however, was not allowed full access to the files. A leaked MI6 liaison email to the Home Office spelled out the reasoning. Granting spousal access risks leak exposure and reputational tampering. Prince Harry is not considered a neutral party. Those last words, "not considered a neutral party," spread across social media, like wildfire fueling speculation about loyalty and trust within the family itself. In Parliament, new questions arose. Why had the therapist not spoken sooner? The answer was sobering. She had spoken, she insisted, but early warnings had been dismissed as emotional venting. Only when real-world patterns began to mirror the words inside her office did officials listen. And when they listened, every road led back to one point. Every phrase, every note, every recording had Catherine at its center, not just as a rival, but as an obstacle that had to be neutralized. One entry dated July 1, 2025, captured the strategy with clinical clarity. Kate doesn't have to fall publicly. She just has to be questioned privately over and over until people flinch when they say her name. It was not cruelty that shocked MPs. It was calculation. The quiet repetition of doubt multiplied in the background until perception itself began to shift. Analysts called it reputation erosion. Watchdogs described it more bluntly, a strategy guide. And then in the midst of silence, Catherine answered. Not with a press release, not with a televised interview, but with an image, On July 9th, at a children's mental health event, she was photographed carrying a copy of The Power of Stillness, a book about resilience and psychological resistance. When asked directly by a reporter how she was coping, she paused, then said simply, "Some things speak loudest when we don't shout." Body language experts later called it the most defining moment of the saga. Calm, steady, devastating. To supporters, it was a message not just to one individual, but to the world. She had seen the storm, and she was not moving. Meanwhile, the fallout for the other side was swift. Public appearances were canceled. A new podcast season was quietly delayed. Hollywood advisors described the move as strategic retreat. Legal teams weighed whether MI6 or Parliament would make formal statements, but the brand damage was already visible. In surveys, trust was collapsing. Once seen as a potential redemption figure, she was now perceived as orchestrating a campaign of destruction and losing control of it. Inside Westminster, MPs began to describe the affair not as palace gossip, but as a matter of state. The codename Whistle Crown appeared on more documents, and behind those documents lay a simple reality. Catherine had not lifted a finger, yet she had survived attempts to dismantle her image. That, observers said, is what resilience looks like. But one question remained. If the storm had already roared, was the world finally ready to face the truth about how it began? In the final days of July, the case reached its conclusion, not in headlines, but in silence. The therapist who first held the notes left London under temporary protection, her final testimony submitted before departure. "I am not proud it took this long," she wrote. "But the moment I realized she wasn't healing, she was rehearsing, I could not stay silent." It was the single sentence that reframed the entire affair. What had once been dismissed as therapy confessions had in fact been exercises in strategy. What the world had viewed as a rivalry was revealed to be something more deliberate, more designed. Parliament's subcommittee, still bound by classification, offered no public notes from its hearings. Yet leaks described members leaving sessions visibly shaken. One MP admitted privately, this was obsession disguised as recovery. If she weren't tied to royalty, it would have been labeled a psychological operation long ago. Public sentiment solidified quickly. Polls showed majorities now believing Catherine had been unfairly targeted, while confidence in her opponent's public projects collapsed. Hollywood executives spoke in whispers of a brand in retreat. Streaming platforms quietly adjusted contracts, scaling down storylines that once promised redemption. And Catherine, she, remained still. No public statements, no counter-campaigns. Only the image of her holding the power of stillness remained interpreted as both shield and declaration. A body language analyst summarized the moment this way: "It was not a warning to her rival. It was a message to the world. I see it. I will not move." Inside the palace, staff worked around the clock to reinforce security, yet also to preserve normalcy for her children. Courtiers said she had insisted life continue without spectacle, determined not to let the shadow of obsession alter her public role. By contrast, silence from across the Atlantic deepened. No appearances, no statements, no new episodes. Insiders described a team scrambling to contain fallout, while legal advisors examined whether Parliament's findings would ever be made public. But the damage, many agreed, was irreversible. In the end, the story was not about two women locked in rivalry. It was about one woman who quietly endured while another plotted in the dark. It was about institutions forced to confront what happens when therapy becomes rehearsal, when personal grievance morphs into public strategy. And it was about a crown tested, targeted, but still intact. Because Catherine did not win by shouting louder or by striking back. She won by standing still, allowing the storm to pass, allowing truth to roar louder than rumor. That truth now echoes across London, and beyond a campaign of obsession collapsed under the weight of its own exposure. The crown remained steady, not through force, but through grace. And tonight, The world sees clearly what resilience looks like when silence is not weakness, but strength.